So this morning, I'm a little bit torn. As a father, I really want for Marshall to be able to sleep, but as the preacher this morning, I might be offended if he does. So when we on the pastoral team had discussed spreading the load of preaching among a couple more people, I had volunteered to preach 3 sermons this year in order to give it a little bit of a better try. Now, usually I have the topic picked out months in advance and I know exactly what I'm going to be preaching on, but this time was a little different. I didn't quite feel led towards one topic or another, and when I heard that Pastor Bob had this practice of preaching from the lectionary text, I decided to give that a try. The lectionary text is simply a text that much of the church throughout the world follows. And so this Sunday, much of the world is preaching from this text, from Psalm 51 and from 2 Samuel. So the same story. And it gives structure and it gives resources to preachers. But when I signed up for this, I did not know what the topic was of this Sunday. I did not know that it was David and Bathsheba. And when I read that, I just said, whew, wow, that is a heavy topic. But it just jumped out so much, and it demanded to be the topic for this morning. So that was how it was chosen. I decided to just go with it, with what God was sharing. What are 2 things that you are thankful for this morning? Think about it a little bit. What are 2 things that you are thankful for this morning? Take a minute and share it with each other. Share it with your neighbor. Turn to a neighbor and share 1 or 2 things that you are thankful for. Take your time. Sounds like people are wrapping up a little bit. I hope for those couples who are sitting next to each other that they said, I'm thankful for you. If not, you still have a couple seconds. This morning, we're going to be looking at a story of someone who had every reason in the world to be grateful, but yet for some reason he seems to be having a really tough time practicing gratitude. We're going to be taking a look at the story of David and Bathsheba through a creative retelling. David had everything a man could want. But there he was, pacing around on the roof of his palace, uptight and restless. He tried laying down for a nap, and that didn't work. Something was gnawing at his stomach. Where had that spark gone? Remember when he was so joyful about the return of God's ark that he danced half naked in the streets? Now he felt that God was so far away. His prayer life was in the pits. He still prayed, but it felt like he was talking to the wall. For a man after God's own heart, he sure didn't feel like he knew God's heart anymore. Gone were the days when he could speak to God so clearly and hear him. It was one thing to hear God's voice when you were out in the field with nothing but sheep around you. You had long days to think and pray and reflect. Now his days were filled with battle reports and meetings, ruling an ever-expanding kingdom and taking care of his own household. Now, how did managing your own household ever get so difficult? It sure didn't seem so tough when he was growing up. It didn't seem like his dad, like it was something that kept his dad up at night. But then, of course, his dad only had one wife and a handful of children. David had 7 wives, and How many concubines again? David lost track. Those sons also never quite got along with their half-brothers, and David knew a couple of them had their eye on his throne. He just wasn't sure how anxious they were for it, or if they would be content to wait until he passed by natural means to take over his spot. Maybe this is why God had commanded that kings not take on too many wives. But of course, God had also said that kings shouldn't take on too many horses or acquire too much gold, and 2 out of 3 is pretty good, right? With all the stress at home, David might have been better off commanding the troops from the front lines, like he used to. But then he'd have to sleep on those field cots, and his back wasn't the same as it used to be. After all those years sleeping in the pastures and then in caves while running from Saul, he was glad to have his sleep number bed at home. Not that all those days were bad running from Saul. It sure showed him who among his men could be trusted and he could rely on. His personal guard, the so-called 30 mighty men, were still made up of those guys who had bravely fought off enemies when death looked all but certain. Their houses were now in prominent places near the palace, both to show them respect and also so that they could be there if trouble ever arose. Why, they lived so close that he could see onto the roofs of their houses. Of course, it wasn't just the discomfort and effort of going to war that kept him away. Why, victories, they just weren't as exciting anymore now that he wasn't trying to prove himself. Defeating Goliath, now, that was something else. He smiles as he remembers just where that rock hit and the thud of the giant hitting the ground. He thinks back perplexed. What on earth led me to fight the giant? I was so young, I should have gotten killed. Now, of course, we know that it was his great faith in God that led him to stand up to the giant who was insulting Israel and their God. But nowadays, with the distance between God and David, he might figure, you know what, God can handle it. Or if God has a problem with the giant, let him send down some fireballs to make it right. In short, David was having a midlife crisis. That is when he spotted her. She was there on a nearby rooftop, having a bath. It was her purifying bath following her menstrual period. Nothing so unusual about that. People often had baths on their rooftops. What was unusual was that David felt his male energies stirring in a way that he hadn't felt for a while. None of his wives, none of his concubines made him feel that way any longer. They're all too old for me, David told himself, knowing it wasn't really true. Some of his new concubines were in their teens. David clapped his hands, and a servant came running. "Who is that woman there on the rooftop?" he demanded. "That is Bathsheba. She is the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of your mighty men. Go and bring her here." But sir, she belongs to... "I don't care who she belongs to," yelled David. "Go and get her." Bathsheba's eyes, they pleaded no when she was brought trembling to David. She loved her husband and knew that he would be devastated. But what could a woman say to the king? Once David had slept with her once or twice, he sent her home. David didn't think a whole lot about it. He knew the servant wouldn't squeal and nobody would believe Bathsheba. But then a couple weeks later, a note came. "I'm pregnant." David knew that he was in trouble. There were rules that even a king could not break. Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, was off fighting the war with Joab. "Send for Uriah the Hittite," King David said. "Hey, how's it going?" David was all smiles and handshakes when Uriah came into the palace. "Tell me about the war. Going well, is it?" Fine," Fine, said Uriah, not quite knowing what to make of all of this. Look, Uriah, you've been working hard. Take a day off. Go home to your good wife. She's got to be lonely. Thank you very much, said Uriah. You're very kind, sir. But Uriah didn't go home. He slept in the gatehouse, refusing to go to Bathsheba. Why didn't you go home and enjoy that beautiful wife of yours, Uriah? But sir, said Uriah, there is a custom in Israel, and even though I am not a Hebrew, I honor it. We do not go down to our homes when our comrades are in the field of battle and sleeping in tents. It's simply not fair. You're a good man, said David, seething inside and worried. You're a better Hebrew than most Hebrews. So let's do lunch. Better yet, let's have dinner. You're a good man. Let's catch up on some old times. It's hard having dinner with a king. When the king says, have another glass of wine, Uriah, it's hard to refuse. And the king kept saying that over and over, and Uriah left the palace stumbling and drunk. But he slept it off in the gatehouse and didn't go anywhere near Bathsheba. Now, furious, David sat down and wrote a note to General Joab. Joab, I want Uriah up at the front of the hardest fighting. Then pull back so he's fighting all by himself. I want this man dead. That is an order. David sealed the note and sent Uriah with his own execution order back to the battlefront. When word came back that Uriah was dead, David waited until the appropriate mourning period was over, then brought Bathsheba to the palace. He quickly married her and sent her off to stay with all his other wives and concubines. And in due time, she had a baby boy. Not long after, Nathan the prophet came for a visit. Knowing that Nathan spoke directly from God made David a little bit nervous. Though he wasn't as sensitive to God's Spirit as he used to be, he still had a conscience. And it nagged at him whenever he saw Bathsheba, or whenever he looked from his balcony and saw that empty roof. He knew God's law inside and out. Why, David had even written whole psalms about how he delighted in God's law. He knew he had done wrong. Whew. No worries, he calmed himself. Nathan frequently came around. He's probably just looking for my advice on another legal issue, because Nathan and David often spent time working through issues of justice in the administration of the nation. Nathan hadn't been around for a while, and the prophet looked strained and tired. Your Majesty, said the prophet, I've got a situation I'd like to discuss with you. Sure, said the king, lay it on me. Well, you see, it's about these two guys. They live next to each other. One of them is the CEO type in this company. He's got a 10-bedroom mega house, everything. The other guy rents a room next door. He's out of a job and he's flat broke. He owns a lamb. It's a pet, really. It's really the only thing that he owns. Him and his family play with it. They sleep with it. The lamb is part of their family. It was. One day, the rich man next door had some unexpected visitors. He's too cheap to cook his own food, so he sends one of his servants next door to snitch the sheep. And he cooks that for his guests. What do you think should happen? Happen? David was outraged. Take that guy and string him up by his thumbs. What a rotten thing to do. Can you imagine being so, where is this guy? Who is he? It's you, said Nathan. What? It's you, your majesty. Look, you have a palace full of women, and yet you stole Bathsheba from Uriah. Then you had him killed. First theft, then rape, then murder. Anger, then shame, and guilt, and finally remorse flowed across the king's face. Nathan knew the king had the power to kill him right there on the spot for making such an accusation. The silence in the room was long and deafening. Finally, the king spoke. I have sinned against God. Now, the purpose of us looking at this text, of me telling the story, is not so that we can condemn David or point out his faults, in which there are many in this story. But rather, the goal is that we would learn so that we can avoid making the same mistakes that David made. The saying rings true that those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. You can learn the hard way, or you can learn the easy way. So what do we take away from a lesson like this? What would you tell David as he stands on that balcony? I think the most common answer, and certainly one that is often written to men wrestling with lust, is to run, to look away, or to get an accountability buddy. And I'm not going to stand here today and say that those things are wrong. By no means. They are good tools and tactics. But I have come to believe that they're not enough. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to put out a fire as it's already strong and blazing. And once a fire is blazing, it's a lot of work to put out. In David's case, it would have required an amazing force of the will to turn and walk away when his heart was obviously not in the right place to start with. For most people, you can only muster the energy and willpower to resist strong temptations so many times before you break and then fall into guilt and shame. And that guilt and shame becomes a cycle of falling into temptation, asking for forgiveness, standing back up on your feet, but then being tempted again, as we always will, mustering the courage, but then falling before too long, and the cycle starts over again. What if there was a way to break this cycle? To change the heart itself so that it is less prone to the temptations around us. And I believe that we can through practicing radical gratitude. Let's go back to David's story. Cultivating a life of thanksgiving would have saved him and Uriah and Bathsheba and a whole bunch of other people a whole lot of anguish. And it could bring more life and joy to our lives just by remembering what we have already. Now, you can bet that David was not practicing regular gratitude. Why? His wives and concubines were undoubtedly some of the most beautiful and gifted women in Israel. And I should say here that we're not talking about whether he or anybody else should have more than one spouse. That is a whole other sermon, and I'm more than happy to let that up to Pastor Bob to explain to you guys. I'll bet any one of David's subjects would have been more than happy. They would have been thrilled with just one of his wives or concubines, but not David. David is not content. Not that he couldn't have been content, but that he didn't do the work necessary in order to be grateful. He could have simply avoided this whole series of events and been happier in the process. Imagine for a second David sitting on his bed, waking up from a nap again, and saying, Lord, thank you so deeply for this beautiful kingdom that you have entrusted me with. I thank you that my people are safe and that we have plenty. I thank you so dearly for my beautiful, talented wives. Lord, I'm so grateful for the women that you have entrusted to me and for the joy they bring to my days. Imagine that kind of heart that David is cultivating in the same situation that he was in. Then he goes out onto the balcony and sees Bathsheba. Now, what would a heart filled with gratitude say? Here's what I think he would say. He'd say, wow, what a beautiful woman. I never realized how good Uriah had it. Good for him. No, he is a good and trusted friend and protector. You know what? I better be sure these battles wrap up soon so my men can come home and be with their wives. Then he would go back inside and make it happen. Because gratitude makes us grateful and not greedy. It makes us grateful not only for what we have, but it makes us thankful for what other people have as well, rather than greedy for what they have and wanting to make it ours. If you were to sit through a world history class, you would notice that the great men of history that take center stage have one thing in common. They have an insatiable greed, and they have the power to bring others in their search for more. Alexander the Great was not content in Little Macedonia. He wanted to take over as much of the world as possible. Genghis Khan was not content in Mongolia. He wanted to take over the entire world. Hitler was not content with the Germans being in Germany and wanted their power to expand. Millions, probably billions of people would have lived longer, happier lives if only certain people throughout history would have practiced gratitude. And everyone on earth stands to live a better life now, one filled with joy by practicing thanksgiving each and every day. Now, how about you? Are you grateful? Really, how could you say no? Really, you can't say, no, I'm not grateful. In our culture, only an absolute wretch would say, no, I'm not grateful. My guess, however, is that there is a level of gratitude that we have not tasted before. It goes beyond the, sure, I'm grateful, to absolutely overflowing for gratitude for who God is and for what he has done. Gratitude for your wife or your husband, or maybe even for the fact that you are single and can do as you please. It's gratitude for our safe, secure, and climate-controlled houses. It's gratitude for the food that comes from across the world to our homes. It's gratitude for this community of believers that we are a part of, for the everlasting, abundant life that we are promised. And we can go on and on and on expressing gratitude, and we probably should. Now, let me underscore this a little bit more. When I'm talking about expressing gratitude, it's not just the type of gratitude that we say when we say thanks for a meal, or thank you for someone opening up the door for us. Rather, I'm talking about a practice, a discipline of ours, so that we can intentionally cultivate a new type of heart. It's the type of gratitude that goes into your room and you say, Lord, thank you for the beautiful, wonderful wife that you've given me. Thank you for for the fact that she loves me, that she knows me, that she cares for me. Thank you that my wife was able to bear our child and is still going strong. Thank you for all that she is and all that she does, and that I don't deserve my wife. Imagine if David had said that, how his outlook on the world would have been. Imagine if we took on that practice of deeply expressing our gratitude for what God has given us, for our spouses, for our kids, for our house, for our car, for those things that we have that we're blessed with. Imagine the kind of transformation that just happens in here, just by expressing deep gratitude for what He's given us. I bet the folks in Puerto Rico right now who have gone through the hurricane, when they get water restored or electricity restored, are deeply grateful every time they turn on a switch and lights turn on. What used to be so mundane, or can be so mundane for us, all of a sudden is a miracle again. Or when they turn on the faucet and the water comes, clean water. Again, these little things that we take for granted can become our deepest joys if we practice gratitude. Do you want to be controlled by God's will, which brings life, rather than sin and selfishness, which brings slow decay? There's the standard advice to squash sin, to suppress yourself, to avoid temptation at all costs. And those are good strategies. But when practiced alone, they tend to lead towards legalism, towards building big walls between us and the world, towards keeping the world out at every cost. Consider this. If you want to follow God's laws, take a look at His 10 Commandments. Practice gratitude. Practice thanksgiving. For when we are grateful, we remember God our Father and we worship Him. When we are grateful, we do not covet what our neighbor has, be it their house, their spouse, or their job. When we practice gratitude, we don't steal what belongs to another. And when we practice gratitude, we do not murder in order to get ahead or to take revenge. When we practice gratitude, our vision naturally begins to shift from me and my needs, and we start to see the lives of others and how we might contribute to them and their needs. As we realize our abundance, we discover that there's more than enough to go around. Now, while the most obvious lesson to take from this passage, David and Bathsheba, would be to preach repentance and forgiveness, what I pray today is that you gain a powerful tool that you can use every single day. And I pray that we do use it every single day. I pray that as we realize the power of expressing gratitude to our Lord, that doing that changes our hearts. That expressing gratitude deeply and intentionally, that it refocuses our eyes away from us and our wants and onto God, and that our hearts and our minds become one with His heart and His mind. And when we fall, and you bet we will, and because we all do, and we are never perfected, we should react as David finally did when he was confronted by Nathan. Not with defensiveness or bitterness, but by admitting our faults and asking for God's mercy. We know that God is willing to give his mercy and willing to give it abundantly. Yet life is no fun when we're constantly putting out fires or cleaning up from the wreckage that selfishness leaves in our lives. It's much more enjoyable and much healthier if we cultivate hearts of gratitude. Not only do we then realize the beauty that is all around us already, but all the temptations that might otherwise look so good, so rewarding, those temptations begin to pale in comparison with the good gifts that God has already given us. So what are two things that you are thankful for? Take a minute and ponder those as we move to the response hymn.